listening to what you said. I just wanted to make a short remark. Seen from France, the paradoxical situation is that the failure of Copenhagen made people realize that the problem was sharp. I think things have really changed in the opinion, at least in France, since Copenhagen, and maybe because it was a failure.
You mean toward pragmatism?
Yeah, and what you call soft agreements. That's why I said I don't know, because it will be exactly that. People will congratulate and say they achieved something. So maybe people won't listen really, and after that, what counts is what people implement in reality, and that might be in the media or not, or not.
That's a good conclusion for our second part. What will be in the media also depends on what science writers will write about the agreement. So we move with this time Leigh that will speak.
Well, coming from the denialist continent, yeah, really. You know, when you ask what are the limits of science journalism, you know, what do we expect our journalists to do? All I can say is do your best. I don't know that there will be more than one science journalist reporting at COP21. The reason being we've had an absolute decline in the industry. There are very few science journalists left that have been around for any length of time in the commercial media, print or electronic. The national broadcaster, the ABC, has had its budgets cut ferociously by the ideological government that thinks that everybody that works at the ABC is a socialist follower and a latte-sipping, tambourine thrashing, daycare collective activist that is against the free market. You know, complete paranoia on the part of this ideological government. So there are not very many resources available to the journalists that are working in this area, with a few that are left. The national newspaper, so to speak, that I used to work for, the Australian, might send its environment writers simply because, although he's a very smart man and he personally is committed to environmental action, he and his wife have purchased property in South America to convert it into a conservation zone. He will write complete and utter, I'm going to use Tony Abbott's word again, crap. He will say anything. He quotes denialist organizations, he drags up specious arguments, reruns old things that have been disproven years ago, and is currently running a campaign against wind farms. You know, they cause serious wind farms in Europe. This is well documented. I'm not kidding, this is astonishing. The other main newspaper chain doesn't have any money, they're going broke, they are busy firing people left, right, and center. So that leaves whom? Not really anybody, because in Australia, we have one man, Rupert Murdoch, who owns or controls over 80% of the media. And he's decided, or his editors have decided, to target the resources industry as their target audience and to speak to them, to the right-wing government, which is why we have this appalling government with its anti-intellectual, anti-environmentalist attitude towards climate change and climate science. They do not want to hear it, they do not want to know about it. So it's hard for me to really say how I would recommend going about doing it. If I were covering it from Australia, I would probably be covering it from Australia, and I'd be making my contacts with people I know that are going to be attempting to participate in various sections across the board. Whether they're, and I would talk to a host of people, whether they be the political masters at the table, the various non-governmental organizations that are attending, and the assorted hangers-on that are interested in talking about the real fundamental science and where the policies are going. So to kind of wrap this little quick section up, in other words, what are the roles and limits of science journalists covering COP21? Do your best. That's all I can offer. Good luck. Don't go broke.
And I hope you have a more optimistic message for science journalists. It's your turn. Yeah.
Well, the good thing about science journalists is they tend to focus on data. And the thing that they can bring to this, even if they don't go to Paris, you don't have to be there. I've co-reported several of the treaty negotiations with a foreign correspondent who's been involved, where I've been in Hudson Valley doing the back reporting. But just track the numbers. Look at what people are saying. It's the same thing you would do for anything. You know, what's new, and then how do you define new? What is new in terms of the language? Are there actually words that are binding? Talk to a lawyer. You know, where are the wiggle words? They're always there. What's success? How are people defining success or failure? What is their metric? If it's 2 degrees, it's kind of silly because that's not a science-based number. And you dig back into the realities behind it. It was a negotiated, politically framed goal. 350 is still a number that's a questionable number in terms for many scientists, including many policy people. What are people's motivations? I mean, this is the thing. You all know this. You wouldn't be at this meeting if you didn't know. What's my motivation? It's the old actor's studio. The Hollywood actors used to train to get in the character. But you have to ask, why is this person telling me this? And if it's a developing country, everyone has a different definition of global warming. Every country or faction of countries that goes to these talks has a different sense of success. If you're from Ethiopia, your sense of success is not the same as President Obama's. And so getting behind the language as much as you can, and getting familiar with the context. So many of the issues that you're going to see play out, not just in Paris, but whatever comes next, a year or two and a decade from now, was actually enshrined in this process in 1992 by some pretty clever lobbyists, lawyers for people who didn't want a treaty to succeed. There are these sort of poison pills, whatever you call them. They're little time bombs that were planted way back then that are going off now. There are words like common but differentiated. You'll hear that phrase, common but differentiated responsibilities. That's one of those flex phrases that gives everybody, yes, we're committed to avoiding global warming, but differentiated responsibilities, meaning the rich countries have to do more than the poor countries. But now China's getting like way less poor, right? So what are they're fighting, they're saying we're still a developing country. We still have differentiated responsibilities. So that leads to endless debate. The fact that it's a consensus process that everyone has to agree was planted essentially a sort of a release valve that was put into this treaty process a long time ago. And that's why at each one of these treaties you always see there's a sharp, quick gavel by whoever has the chair. And that's why you always end up with an agreement. But it's not, but it's the process behind that is really not as clear as that noise. So just learn a little bit about the background, and then the most important thing is what's missing. This has happened even in the IPCC reports. What do they leave out? What do they gloss over? You'll see in the IPCC reports phrases like, we can decarbonize the economy with technology that we know or that's out there. We don't need new stuff. But then when you dig in, you realize that actually we don't know how to do that. The countries of the world, the rich countries of the world, have lagged enormously in how much we invest in basic science related to energy innovation. Innovation is different than science. Someone has to do the basic physics and chemistry that gets you a new solar panel. And that process is, when you look at and I've shown this on my blog and on page 1 of the New York Times, 2006, many, many times. And the treaty process never talks about innovation, never talks about money for science. And when you really talk to like Kostas Samaras from Carnegie Mellon University, who tracks that, and he'll tell you, without commitment on that, all this other stuff is like just dreams and fantasy. So try to keep track of what's missing. And that's what the journalists should be there for. Not just to, as you all know, not just to be a stenographer saying France says this and the EU says that, Greenpeace says this. That doesn't go anywhere.
I talked about France, and of course I could have answered, but it's a complicated game for Europe. What I see for French journalists, that the ones who have been covering environment, that's the so-called environment, I don't really like the be part of nature. Not only, well, that's another story. They will be, first of all, happy because it's a moment of glory, you know. And I have this feeling that all these journalists who have been dealing with these subjects felt so bad at times. So now, as I described, because it became a real political issue, so you will have all the political, economic, and others, even maybe the guys who deal with finance, journalists who will try to cover it, because suddenly it becomes really important, at least for 1 week or 2 weeks. So, as you said previously, at least what the science journalists can do is keep track of what was said previously in previous agreements or conferences, and know the data, give the right figures, know who is talking, not only having the microphone. Because in fact, you know, we hear, I don't know, I had a TV experience, I can do some radio, and I don't know if you're in the printed press, so we tend to think that, you know, we can explain a lot in long articles with a lot of boxes and interviews and everything, but in fact, what will happen? People will listen to TV, and will get information by Twitter, and the younger ones. So it will be the little sentences, the little phrases, the little wording, and maybe if Madame Royale has a flu, or if Mr. Hollande couldn't say a word in English very correctly, as I'm doing now. You know, it will be this atmosphere. It will be like that because they want it to be like that. It will be a circus because it's political. So I think the science journalists have to remain in a way humble and do their homework. At times, try not to tell the others what they should think, because they will hear so much crap that I know how they will be. I know them in my team. They will come back and say, you wouldn't believe it. It's pure crap. And all these journalists who don't know anything about it and want to report about it. So you say, what was your sentence? Don't forget what could be missing, and the other motto was.
Well, what is success? How are people defining success?
Yeah,
what's your motivation?
I would say.
What's the motivation?
Keep calm. Keep calm. Anyhow, afterwards, we will still have to work and understand what's going on. So don't worry.
Keep calm and do your best.
Keep calm and do your best. So we perfectly agree. It will go on. There will be work afterwards and things to report about, and check whether something is really happening. Because, you know, it will be a circus.
Okay, so Dominique spoke about the circus. Now we try to see what kind of show science journalists can present the audience to be heard. So, Leigh? No, it's Andrew. Sorry.
Oh, yeah.
It's your turn.
Well, it's hard, you know. I'm sorry. The core questions are really hard to convey in a way that's not boring. Just talking about carbon, talking about carbon intensity, talking about per capita emissions of greenhouse gases, trying to convey the backstory of the diplomacy is hard. But there are some great narrative approaches to this. One is to back off and talk about the history of this whole struggle with carbon that we've had. You don't have to do it in a song like I did last night at dinner, but it's an amazing story. The way the human race has jumped through history, riding on different fuels, from firewood to coal and oil, now struggling with alternatives when those are still abundant. It's a really, there's drama there. There's on that scale, if you look at it as the story of human development. And then you have this fundamental issue. The drama comes also from the interplay of nations that have such starkly different positions. I'll never forget in 1988, I was at this conference in Toronto. It was the first conference on the changing atmosphere. This was the one that created.
I was at that one.
Okay. Yeah, it was important. And that laid the groundwork for what happened in Rio. It wasn't a treaty conference, but it was the science and policy conference and what happened in 1992. But I was there, and there was this guy from Maldives running around. This is 1988. He was the ambassador to the UN from Maldives, Hussein Manikwan. And he's kind of like looking at this room full of highly carbonized rich countries, and he's talking about sea level rise, which was of course, their main issue. And I included him in my first article on global warming that year. He was in my first book on global warming in 1992, as to try to illustrate how different the vantage points of different nations are in this great theater of the climate challenge. So there's plenty of stories like that to tell. And the histrionics, the young people who are at this conferences are really interesting. They're theatrical and creative, and they have stories to tell that I think are interesting. It is their atmosphere we're battling with more than our own. Those of us who were born in the 20th century are going to die before the big consequences play out. And so telling the story from the vantage point of young people in the room is really interesting. There's 1,000 ways to tell those stories that are interesting. And then there's just the irony part. I remember when I was in Copenhagen, after everything was exploding, and falling apart, and they were on a deadline. They run these things in these giant conference centers, and the Copenhagen one, they were contractually obligated to get out of there to make way for a design show, a furniture design show. And my last piece was make the climate talks make way for a design show, because I was trying to illustrate just this sort of surreal aspect of this. And they had to clear the room, and people were being hustled out, and the signs were all being ripped off the walls. The seal the deal signs were coming down. So I think that's part of the story. That's part of the story of telling it in a way that's interesting and effective. And finally, the other thing is, tell it from the vantage point of your country or wherever you're from. You don't have to go there. I think you heard this alluded to a minute ago. It would be very interesting to tell the story of the climate treaty from a village in Africa that's getting its first solar panel because of Akon, the hip hop artist who wrote about recently, who's has a company that's helping install solar panels in Africa. So if you want to convey that these treaty processes have very little meaning, then go to rural Africa and say, while they're all sitting there having their martinis and smoking their cigars outside and talking about decarbonization, blah, blah. Here's a guy who just got trained to put up solar panels in Mali. And that's a really cool story. So there's 1,000 ways to do it.
Dominique, speaking about subjects.
Well, I have a very concrete example, but I can't show you because we think our deadline is next week. But that's what we are doing about climate change. We do it in advance because we know that it's such a political issue in December that for my magazine, I don't know yet what I'm going to do then. So I do things in advance. So people who are really interested will read it next month and we'll have it in a fortnight. And what is it? I decided that we really had to work hard to not only make a scenario, the scientists do that, but try to understand what will happen on our territory. And I rewrote the editorial, the first article. I put it in, I asked the journalists to do what could happen in in 2035, which is 20 years from now. So it's quite close. Knowing what is said in 2050 and 21,000, no, 2100. So, you know, so that I can tell people who are born today, they will be 20. And younger, your young children or grandchildren who are 10, they will be 35. So what will they check during their life as young adults? And I finished the editorial with 2100 saying, well, when there are 80, and I know that the people who read me, some of them, most of them are around 45 or 50. There are younger ones, obviously, but there are older people too. So when you're talking about people who are 80, it has a meaning also. So I tried to figure out who reads that. And it was a very, very difficult job to precise what will happen with our coastal line, because that's what most of the danger is. What will happen with the forest, what will happen, and this will be, of course, on the cover, with our wine. Of course, I mean, wine talks directly to your heart, and elsewhere, I must confess, but it's subliminal, and at the same time, well, I know it's the second budget in our export.
Yeah.
It's like us and our coal.
It's the second export. So, you know, imagine this cultural shock that champagne will be in England.
Right.
But you know that people are buying land there, south of England, because within 40 years, that's where you find champagne. You start finding very good near Champagne. It's nearly the same. Well, of course, they're not allowed to call it champagne because that's a territory. But now that people are
Wine tasting.
when you do wine tasting, well, very good wine tasters could really make the difference. So, you know, it's still, so that will make people read. Of course, we have, but you know, but we had to work a lot, and we've been working on this subject for years and years, because of the COP21 approaching, the scientists, you wouldn't believe it, but that's reality. They're afraid of talking now. When they talk to us, they ask to be anonymous. Because it's become so political. So, you know, if this guy from CNRS or from another institution, if he says something and he's afraid that it might not help him in his career. Fortunately, because we've been working on the subject for years, we know more or less what will happen. But you know, it's a great responsibility, because what we will do is we will have a big map of France with the name of the big cities and others, and we will write the name of the other cities, well, we will write the name of the cities about which we think, or the scientists think, the climate will be, to make myself clear, you know, we think that in Marseille or in Bordeaux it will be the same climate as in Algiers. So that's clear, or in Bordeaux it will be like Madrid, or in Lille, which is in the north, it will be like Marseille today, something of that kind. I have to check that map. And we hope it will sell. of course, because people want to know what will happen, if not only to themselves, but maybe to their children. Although I find my readers, I have this feeling that they're a little bit egotistic. I hope they still love their children. I'm not totally sure.
That's, well,
Just one other thing. We worked in advance because we thought when it becomes political, we will be lost in the noise. But you mentioned something which is very important. The fact that the negotiation and the buzz around is focused on these 2 degrees. These 2 degrees has become a myth. And people who worked on that could trace back that, well, at a certain point it was decided that 2 degrees was a good figure to talk about. And look, and if you read a large an important newspaper like Le Monde, the last advertisements they have, which is also in the news magazine, is the one by EDF, which is the big electricity operator in France, and which is one of the biggest, maybe the first in the world. They say, we fight for these 2 degrees. If you had talked to them 10 years ago, they would have denied any climate change. So, it's so funny. But that's how things are. So 2 degrees, I think it has to be discussed. Yeah, maybe you've done that already. Sorry if you. I'm telling you things that you know in advance.
Well, I just want to agree with what has been said already. I mean, and the key points that I'm taking away from what Andrew and Dominique have said is that covering a conference like this it's basic journalistic skills, and that's what are being applied. The topic is different than what non-specialists cover, but you get in there, you do your homework, you work in advance, you know what the issues are, you go in and you use your skills to cover that as best and as most effectively as possible. You also need to know your audience, and I think that you discussed that very keenly, Dominique, because you know who your audience is, you know how to target them, you know what they're likely to be interested in. If you're working freelance, you have to know who you're selling your stories to, what their angles are, what they're interested in. If you're working from a newspaper or a general knowledge magazine, blogosphere, you have to be able to decide who pulls the strings, what do they want, what are you likely to deliver. And another thing as a reformed anthropologist that I've used in my career as a science journalist is to remember that we humans evolved to respond to specifics. We tell stories, we don't respond to abstractions. And again, this came up previously, the notion that we'll talk about the mechanisms of climate science, that we'll talk about 2 degrees, we'll talk about these various terminology. People don't relate to that. But I've used that line story myself because Australia has a growing wine industry. We're quite competitive with France at this point. And intriguingly, the wine areas are now moving south as the climate is starting to get warm. So people are already investing in property in Tasmania, which is a little island at the very bottom of Australia. So the general public is aware of these issues regardless of what Tony Abbott and his cronies tend to think about it. So it's